I'll write part 1 of the story in approximately 1,200 words with simple English, a natural tone, and human-centric storytelling. I'll create it as a separate document without headings, avoiding common names and any content that might violate YouTube policies. The morning sun peeked through the blinds as Ellen Thompson packed her small carry-on suitcase. At 68, she had long since mastered the art of traveling light. One change of clothes, essential toiletries, her reading glasses, and a worn paperback novel. That's all she needed for the overnight trip to Washington, D.C. Ellen glanced at the clock. 7:15 a.m. Her flight wasn't until 10, but old habits die hard. In her 30 years as an Air Force nurse, she'd learned that early was on time, and on time was late. She zipped up her suitcase and took one last look in the mirror. Her silver hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and she wore a simple blue blouse with comfortable slacks. Nothing that would draw attention to herself. That's how Ellen preferred things these days. Quiet, anonymous, just another grandmother on her way to visit her daughter and son-in-law. The taxi honked outside her modest Denver home, and she locked the door behind her. "Denver International, please," she told the driver, settling into the back seat. "You got it. Visiting or heading home?" the chatty driver asked. "Visiting my daughter," Ellen answered with a small smile. "She just had her second baby." "Congratulations, Grandma." "Boy or girl?" "A little girl, Charlotte." The driver nodded appreciatively. "Beautiful name." Ellen gazed out the window as Denver's skyline receded behind them. She hadn't mentioned why she was really going to D.C., the ceremony at Arlington tomorrow. Some things were private, and explaining would mean talking about Tom. Even after all these years, that wound had never fully healed. At the airport, Ellen moved through security with practiced efficiency. No jewelry to remove, sensible slip-on shoes, and a boarding pass already displayed on her phone. The young TSA agent barely glanced at her. Just another older woman traveling alone. Nothing remarkable. Gate B-17 was already crowded when she arrived. Business people in suits tapped furiously on laptops. A young couple argued in hushed tones about dinner plans. 3 soldiers in uniform stood together near the window, watching planes take off. Ellen noticed their patches. Air Force. For a moment she felt a tug of recognition, of belonging. Then she pushed it away and found a seat. At the edge of the gate area, Flight 1482 to Washington, D.C. is now boarding passengers with small children and those needing special assistance, the gate agent announced. Ellen waited patiently. She didn't need special assistance, though her right knee sometimes disagreed, especially on cold days. The old shrapnel wound was a barometer more reliable than any weather app. When they called her boarding group, she joined the line, ticket in hand. The flight attendant at the door greeted her with a practiced smile. "Good morning. Welcome aboard." Ellen nodded politely and made her way down the aisle, counting rows. 9, 10, 11, 12. She found her seat, 12F, a window on the right side of the plane. She stowed her small bag under the seat in front and settled in, fastening her seatbelt out of habit before the reminder. A middle-aged businessman took the aisle seat in her row, nodding briefly before returning to his phone. The middle seat miraculously remained empty as the boarding process completed. Small blessings, Ellen thought. The plane pushed back from the gate right on time. Ellen watched the ground crew through her window, remembering long-ago deployments and the strange comfort of military transport planes. No cushioned seats there, just canvas benches and cargo webbing, but there had been camaraderie, purpose. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been cleared for takeoff." The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Flight time to Washington, D.C. today will be 3 hours and 20 minutes. We're expecting clear skies most of the way, with some light turbulence over the Midwest. We'll be cruising at an altitude of 35,000 feet. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the flight." Ellen felt the familiar push as the plane accelerated down the runway, then the slight lift as they became airborne. She never tired of that feeling, the moment when humanity defied gravity. The plane banked east and Denver spread out below them, buildings and roads shrinking to toy size. As they reached cruising altitude, the flight attendants began their service. Ellen accepted a cup of water and declined the pretzels. The businessman beside her ordered a scotch despite the early hour, and immediately returned to his spreadsheets. Ellen pulled out her paperback, a mystery novel she'd started last week, but found herself staring past the pages, her mind drifting. Tomorrow would be 20 years since Tom's funeral. 20 years since the flag-draped coffin, 20 years of attending these ceremonies alone. The aircraft hit a pocket of turbulence, jolting Ellen back to the present. She tucked her book away and gazed out the window at the patchwork landscape below. Farmland stretched to the horizon, neat squares of brown and green. "Folks, this is Captain Reynolds speaking." The intercom crackled to life again. "Just wanted to let you know that we've got a special treat today. If you look out the right side of the aircraft in about 15 minutes, you might catch sight of an Air Force demonstration team practicing maneuvers. They'll be a few miles south of our flight path, but should be visible. Also, I'd like to acknowledge that we have several active-duty military personnel aboard today's flight. We thank you for your service." Ellen felt a small flutter in her chest. The sky outside her window was endless blue, clouds far below them. She remembered flying in the medical evacuation helicopters. How different it had been. Low altitude, doors open, the roar of the rotors and the rush of wind. The constant vigilance, watching for threats below while tending to the wounded. The businessman beside her finally looked up from his work. "You military?" he asked, noticing her interest in the captain's announcement. "Long time ago," Ellen replied quietly. "Thank you for your service," he said, the phrase automatic before returning to his device. Ellen nodded, though he wasn't looking anymore. Those words always felt strange to her. What exactly was she being thanked for? For the lives she'd saved? For the ones she couldn't save? For the birthdays and anniversaries missed? For the nightmares that still sometimes came? A flight attendant stopped at their row. "Can I get you anything else?" "I'm fine, thank you," Ellen said. The young woman tilted her head slightly. "Have we met before?" "You look familiar." Ellen shook her head. "I don't think so." "Sorry, my mistake," the attendant said with a professional smile, moving on to the next row. Ellen turned back to the window. It happened occasionally, someone thinking they recognized her. Years ago, after the incident, her picture had been in newspapers, on television. There had been interviews, ceremonies, a brief moment of fame she'd never wanted. But that was long ago and memory fades. Now she was just another face in the crowd. Just another passenger in seat 12F, and that's exactly how she preferred it. I've created the first part of your story in a document format. This opening segment introduces Ellen Thompson, using a different name than the ones you asked to avoid, as a retired Air Force nurse traveling to Washington, D.C. The narrative establishes her character as humble and private, someone who doesn't draw attention to herself despite her military background. I've kept the language simple and natural, with a human-centric focus on her thoughts, memories, and small interactions during a routine flight. The story hints at her past and sets up the coming recognition without revealing too much. I've avoided any content that might violate YouTube policies and maintained an engaging tone that feels authentic rather than AI-generated. Would you like me to continue with part 2 of the story, or would you like any adjustments to part 1? I'll write part 2 of the story in approximately 1,200 words using simple English and a natural tone. I'll create it as a separate document without headings, focusing on human-centric storytelling that feels authentic rather than AI-generated, while avoiding any content that might violate YouTube policies. Ellen watched as tiny puffs of white clouds drifted beneath the wing of the airplane. The flight had been smooth so far, the gentle hum of the engines almost lulling her to sleep. She checked her watch. They were about halfway to Washington now. The businessman next to her had dozed off, his laptop closed on the tray table. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Reynolds again." The intercom crackled to life. "I'm afraid I have some news about our flight path. There's a line of severe thunderstorms developing over the Ohio Valley that we need to avoid. Air traffic control has given us a new route that will take us a bit south of our original flight plan. This might add about 20 minutes to our arrival time, but safety comes first." A collective groan rose from several passengers. Ellen remained quiet, gazing out at the sky. She'd experienced far worse delays in her life. Being stuck on a tarmac in Saudi Arabia during a sandstorm, waiting 3 days for extraction from a remote village in Afghanistan, when bad weather grounded all aircraft. A 20-minute delay was nothing to complain about. The plane began a gentle turn to the south. Within 15 minutes, Ellen could see dark clouds forming on the horizon, massive thunderheads rising like mountains in the distance. The captain had made the right call. Folks, we're going to be experiencing some light turbulence as we skirt around this weather system, the captain announced. I've turned on the fasten seatbelt sign, so please return to your seats and make sure your seatbelts are securely fastened. The first bump came moments later, just a slight jostle, but enough to wake the businessman. He blinked groggily and reflexively checked his phone. How long was I out? He asked no one in particular. About an hour, Ellen replied politely. The plane dipped suddenly, causing several passengers to gasp. A baby started crying somewhere behind them. The businessman gripped the armrests, his knuckles turning white. Not a fan of turbulence? Ellen asked. Is anyone? He replied with a nervous laugh. It helps to look at the horizon, she suggested. Your body gets confused when what you feel doesn't match what you see. Looking at something stable can help. He nodded but kept his eyes straight ahead, deliberately not looking out the window as the plane bounced again, more forcefully this time. A flight attendant's voice came over the intercom, unnecessarily cheerful. Just a little bump in the road, folks. Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened. We'll resume our beverage service once we're through this patch of weather. The turbulence intensified. Overhead bins rattled. Someone's water bottle rolled down the aisle. Ellen remained calm, watching the storm clouds in the distance. She'd learned long ago that panic never helped any situation. The businessman beside her was breathing rapidly, eyes closed, muttering something under his breath. It's just air pockets, Ellen said softly, like driving over potholes. The plane is designed to handle much worse than this. He nodded without opening his eyes, but his breathing slowed a bit. The captain's voice returned, more serious now. Ladies and gentlemen, we've just been informed that the weather system has expanded more rapidly than predicted. We're going to need to divert to an alternate airport to wait it out. We've been cleared to land at Langley Air Force Base in Virginia. We should be on the ground in about 20 minutes. A murmur of concern spread through the cabin. Military bases weren't typical diversion points for commercial flights. Langley? The businessman asked, momentarily forgetting his fear. Can they even take civilian aircraft? They have a long runway, Ellen replied. It was an alternate landing site for the space shuttle. They can handle a commercial airliner. He looked at her curiously. How do you know that? Ellen smiled faintly. I was stationed there a long time ago. The plane descended through clouds, the cabin dimming as they entered the grayness. Rain began to streak across Ellen's window. The turbulence grew worse during the descent, the aircraft seeming to drop and catch itself repeatedly. More than one passenger was now using the air sickness bags. Ellen closed her eyes, not from fear but from memory. She'd made emergency landings before, ones far more dangerous than this. She remembered the helicopter with a failing engine, the field hospital during a mortar attack, the medical evacuation under enemy fire. Compared to those, this was just a minor inconvenience. The clouds finally broke, revealing the Virginia coastline and beyond it, the sprawling complex of Langley Air Force Base. Ellen felt a strange sensation in her chest, not anxiety, but something like recognition, like returning to a place that had once been home. Ladies and gentlemen, we're on final approach to Langley Air Force Base, the captain announced. Please make sure your seatbelts remain fastened, your tray tables are stowed, and your seats are in the upright position. Once we've landed, we'll provide more information about our delay. We appreciate your patience. The plane banked slightly, lining up with the runway. Ellen could see the base clearly now. The hangars, the control tower, and off to one side a row of aircraft covered in protective shelters. Even from this distance, she recognized the distinctive silhouettes of F-22 Raptors, the Air Force's premier fighter jets. The rain was coming down heavily as the plane descended the final few hundred feet. The landing gear extended with a thud that vibrated through the cabin. Then came the moment of touchdown, a screech of tires, the roar of engines reversing thrust, the powerful deceleration pushing Ellen back into her seat. They had arrived safely, if not at their intended destination. As they taxied toward a distant hangar, Ellen saw military vehicles already approaching the runway. Standard procedure for an unscheduled civilian aircraft landing on a military base. The plane came to a complete stop far from the main terminal buildings. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Langley Air Force Base, the captain said. I've just been informed that this weather system is expected to pass within the next 2 to 3 hours. Until then, base personnel will be escorting us to a waiting area where we can be more comfortable than sitting on the aircraft. Please remain seated until we receive further instructions. The businessman beside Ellen sighed with relief. both at being on solid ground and at the prospect of stretching his legs. "Well, this is an adventure," he said, attempting to sound upbeat. "Not every day you get to visit an Air Force base." Ellen nodded, looking out at the rain-soaked runway and the base beyond. It had been nearly 15 years since she'd last been here. So much had changed, yet so much looked exactly the same. A knock came on the cockpit door, and a moment later the flight attendant's voice returned. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been cleared to deplane. Air Force personnel will be escorting us to a facility where we can wait out the storm. Please take all your personal belongings with you, as we may not be returning to this aircraft if another becomes available. Deplaning will begin momentarily." As passengers started gathering their things, Ellen remained seated, looking out at the base that held so many memories. She saw an airman in rain gear directing ground personnel, a familiar sight from another lifetime. "Ma'am?" The flight attendant was standing in the aisle, addressing her. "We're ready to deplane now." Ellen nodded and stood, retrieving her small bag from under the seat. She followed the flow of passengers toward the exit, stepping carefully on the wet stairs that had been rolled up to the aircraft door. At the bottom, young airmen held large umbrellas, escorting passengers in groups toward a nearby building. As Ellen's feet touched the tarmac of Langley Air Force Base for the first time in 15 years, she felt a strange sensation wash over her, like slipping between two worlds or two versions of herself. The retired grandmother from Denver faded slightly, and for just a moment she was Colonel Thompson again, with lives depending on her quick thinking and steady hands. The rain fell around her, but Ellen barely noticed. She was home in a way, and something told her this unexpected detour was about to become much more than a simple weather delay. "I've created part 2 of your story in a document format. This section develops the narrative as Ellen's routine flight encounters unexpected turbulence and is diverted to Langley Air Force Base due to severe weather. The writing maintains a simple, natural tone while building tension through the turbulent flight and emergency landing. I've focused on Ellen's calm demeanor during the crisis, hinting at her military background and experience with much more dangerous situations in the past. The human-centric storytelling continues through small interactions with the businessman seated next to her and Ellen's emotional response to returning to a base where she was once stationed. The narrative feels authentic with realistic details about air travel, weather diversion protocols, and military bases. This part sets up the coming recognition by bringing Ellen to a military environment where her past might be discovered, while maintaining the engaging pace established in Part 1. Would you like me to continue with Part 3, or would you like any adjustments to Part 2? I'll write Part 3 of the story in approximately 1,200 words with simple English and a natural tone. I'll create it as a separate document without headings, continuing the human-centric storytelling that feels authentic rather than AI-generated, while avoiding any content that might violate YouTube policies. The base personnel led the passengers across the rain-soaked tarmac to a large hangar that had been hastily converted into a waiting area. Folding chairs were arranged in rows, and a table with water and coffee had been set up along one wall. Military efficiency at its finest, Ellen thought. In a crisis, no matter how small, the Air Force knew how to handle logistics. Ellen found a seat near the back of the hangar, away from most of the other passengers. She watched as people clustered in groups complaining about the delay, making phone calls to rearrange their plans. The businessman from the plane was already deep in conversation with the airline representative who had accompanied them, demanding information about when they might depart again. A young airman approached Ellen with a clipboard. "Ma'am, I'm helping coordinate with the airline. Could I get your name for our passenger list?" "Ellen Thompson," she replied. "And your final destination today?" "Washington, D.C. Any connecting flights we should be aware of?" Ellen shook her head. "No, just D.C." The airman nodded, writing on his clipboard. "Thank you, ma'am. We're expecting the storm to clear within the next few hours. Base Command has authorized use of this facility until your flight can resume. There's coffee and water available, and we're arranging for some food to be brought over from the mess hall." "That's very kind," Ellen said. "I appreciate the hospitality." The young man smiled. "Just doing our job, ma'am. If you need anything, there are personnel stationed by each door who can help." As he walked away, Ellen glanced around the hangar. It was a working space with equipment pushed to the sides to make room for the stranded passengers. In one corner, partially covered by tarps, She could see what appeared to be components of an aircraft engine, probably a training model for the mechanics. The rain continued to drum on the metal roof of the hangar, creating a steady background rhythm. Despite the circumstances, Ellen found herself feeling oddly at peace. Military installations had always had that effect on her, a sense of order amid chaos, of purpose amid uncertainty. A commotion near the main entrance caught her attention. A young officer had entered, a lieutenant by the insignia on his uniform, and was speaking with the airline representatives. After a brief conversation, he stepped forward to address the passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I'm Lieutenant Wilson, assistant to the base commander. On behalf of Langley Air Force Base, I want to welcome you and apologize for the inconvenience of this unscheduled stop. We've been monitoring the weather system, and I'm afraid it's moving more slowly than initially predicted. We're now expecting a minimum 3-hour delay before conditions will be safe for takeoff." A collective groan rose from the passengers. The lieutenant held up his hands in a calming gesture. "I understand this is frustrating. The good news is that we've arranged for lunch to be provided, and we're setting up a rest area in the adjacent building with more comfortable seating and Wi-Fi access. We'll begin escorting groups over there as soon as it's ready, which should be within the next 30 minutes. He paused, consulting a tablet in his hand. "In the meantime, I want to make sure we're addressing any special needs. If anyone requires medical attention, has critical connecting flights, or has any other urgent concerns, please see me or one of my staff members." Most passengers remained seated, resigned to the delay. A few approached the lieutenant with questions. Ellen stayed where she was, content to wait. After all, she had nowhere to be until tomorrow's ceremony. About 10 minutes later, the lieutenant made his way through the hangar, checking on passengers. When he reached Ellen, he offered a polite smile. "How are you doing, ma'am? Is there anything you need?" "I'm fine, thank you," Ellen replied. "Your team is handling this very well. Just doing what we can," he said. "Were you in the military by any chance? You seem very comfortable with the situation." Ellen hesitated briefly. "Yes, I was. Air Force, retired now." "Thank you for your service," the lieutenant said, the response automatic but sincere. "May I ask what your role was?" "Flight nurse," Ellen said simply. 30 years. Retired as a colonel." The lieutenant's posture subtly shifted, a slightly straighter spine, a more focused attention. Military courtesy toward a senior officer, even a retired one. "What was your name and unit, ma'am, if you don't mind me asking?" Ellen sighed softly. She hadn't intended to share this information, but there was little point in hiding it now. "Colonel Ellen Thompson, 59th Medical Wing. I served in various medical evacuation units throughout my career." The lieutenant's eyes widened slightly. He glanced down at his tablet, then back at Ellen. "Thompson, from Operation Desert Storm, the Al-Qaisuma incident." Ellen felt a familiar tightness in her chest. She nodded once, her face carefully neutral. "That was a long time ago, Lieutenant. Ma'am, would you excuse me for just a moment?" he asked, his voice suddenly formal. Without waiting for her response, the lieutenant stepped away, tapping rapidly on his tablet. Ellen watched him go, a sinking feeling in her stomach. So much for anonymity. She should have given a vague answer or none at all. Now the quiet journey she had planned was likely to be disrupted. She considered moving to a different section of the hangar, perhaps even asking to be escorted to the restroom and finding a more secluded spot to wait. But before she could act on the thought, the lieutenant was returning, and he wasn't alone. Walking beside him was an older officer with commander's insignia, moving with purpose through the scattered chairs. Ellen straightened instinctively, years of military protocol impossible to ignore. The commander approached directly, stopped at a respectful distance, and spoke in a low, controlled voice. "Colonel Thompson, I'm Commander Howard, acting base commander while Colonel Chen is in Washington. The lieutenant informs me that we have the honor of hosting a distinguished visitor today." "That's very kind, Commander, but I'm just a retired officer catching a commercial flight," Ellen replied. "There's no need for special attention." The commander smiled slightly. "With respect, ma'am, when the Angel of Al-Qaisuma visits my base even accidentally, it warrants attention." Ellen winced at the old nickname. "I'd prefer to keep a low profile, Commander. I'm just trying to get to D.C. for a memorial service." "I understand, ma'am," he said, his tone softening. "But there are 3 pilots on this base who would never forgive me if I didn't at least offer to introduce them. They've studied your case extensively at the academy. What you did that day is still taught in our tactical response courses. Ellen was about to decline again when she caught sight of 3 younger officers approaching from across the hangar. They wore flight suits, F-22 pilots based on the patches. Their faces held an expression she recognized immediately. The look of junior officers meeting someone they'd only read about in training manuals. The lead pilot, a captain with the name Rodriguez, stitched on his flight suit, stopped several paces away. All 3 came to attention simultaneously. A crisp, formal stance reserved for senior officers and moments of deep respect. "Colonel Thompson," Commander Howard said, "these are some of our F-22 demonstration team pilots. They were scheduled for a training flight when the storm moved in. Captain Rodriguez here actually wrote his academy thesis on medical evacuations under enemy fire, with your mission as the central case study." Ellen felt a complex mixture of emotions: embarrassment at the attention, pride in what her team had accomplished that day, and a deep sadness for those who hadn't returned. She stood slowly, nodding to the pilots. "At ease, gentlemen," she said quietly, falling back into the familiar cadence of command. "I appreciate the recognition, but what happened at Al-Qaisuma was the work of an entire team, most of whom aren't here to receive your thanks." Captain Rodriguez stepped forward, maintaining a respectful posture. "Ma'am, if you wouldn't mind, we'd be honored if you would join us in the officers' mess. We've heard the official reports, but there's so much we could learn from your first-hand experience." Ellen looked around at the hangar full of stranded passengers, then back at the earnest faces of the young pilots. These were the next generation, the ones who would face their own Al-Qaisumas someday. Perhaps there was value in sharing what she had learned, the lessons paid for in blood and sacrifice. "Very well," she said finally, "but on one condition, Commander." "Name it, Colonel," Howard replied. "Make sure all these people get a decent meal and comfortable place to wait out this storm. Military or civilian, nobody gets left behind." Commander Howard smiled, a flash of recognition in his eyes. He'd heard those words before. They were part of the legend. "Already in progress, Colonel. Already in progress. I've created part 3 of your story in a document format. This section reveals the beginning of Ellen's recognition as her military background becomes known to the base personnel. The narrative maintains a simple, natural tone while building tension through Ellen's reluctance to be identified and the increasing attention from military personnel. I've focused on authentic human interactions, showing Ellen's mixed emotions about being recognized and her continued concern for others even as she becomes the center of attention. The writing includes realistic military protocols and terminology without being overly technical, making it accessible while maintaining authenticity. The emotional core of the story continues to develop as we learn more about Ellen's past through the reactions of those who recognize her significance. This part advances the plot by revealing that Ellen, the Angel of Al-Qaisuma, is a respected military figure whose actions are still studied at the Air Force Academy, setting up the full revelation of her heroism that will come in Part 4. Would you like me to continue with Part 4, or would you like any adjustments to Part 3? I'll write Part 4 of the story in approximately 1,200 words with simple English and a natural tone. I'll create it as a separate document without headings, continuing the human-centric storytelling that feels authentic rather than AI-generated, while avoiding any content that might violate YouTube policies. The officers' mess was quiet at this hour, the lunch rush having ended before their arrival. Commander Howard led Ellen and the 3 pilots to a corner table, away from the few other personnel scattered around the room. A young airman quickly brought coffee and water. "Can I get you anything to eat, Colonel?" Commander Howard asked. "Just coffee is fine, thank you," Ellen replied, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. The 3 pilots sat across from her, trying not to stare but clearly full of questions. They were young, probably in their early 30s, Ellen guessed, about the same age she had been during the Al-Qaisuma incident. "So," Ellen said after a sip of coffee, "I understand you've studied what happened that day, Captain Rodriguez?" The pilot nodded eagerly. "Yes, ma'am. It's a cornerstone case study in the Advanced Tactical Response course at the Academy. The way your medical team adapted to a combat situation without proper combat training is considered revolutionary." Ellen smiled faintly. There was nothing revolutionary about it. We were just trying to stay alive and save as many people as we could. "But the field triage system you implemented under fire," the female pilot next to Rodriguez interjected. The name on her flight suit read Chen. That's now standard protocol in hot zones. You literally wrote the manual they teach us. Actually, I didn't write that manual, Ellen corrected gently. I filed my report and someone much smarter than me turned it into doctrine. I was just doing what made sense at the time. The third pilot, whose name tag read Wilson, leaned forward. Ma'am, if you don't mind me asking, the reports mention that you were wounded during the initial attack, but continued coordinating the evacuation. How did you manage that? Ellen's hand unconsciously moved to her right knee, where the scar tissue still pulled tight in cold weather. You'd be surprised what becomes possible when there's no alternative, Lieutenant. When people are depending on you, pain becomes secondary. Commander Howard, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. Colonel Thompson is being modest, as I expected. What the official reports don't fully capture is that she continued directing the evacuation while performing emergency surgery on critically wounded personnel, despite having shrapnel in her leg and a bullet grazed to her shoulder. Ellen frowned slightly. The bullet graze was nothing, barely broke the skin, and I had medics working on the critical cases. I just assisted where needed. That's not how General Patterson tells it, Commander Howard said. He says you personally saved his life that day. The three pilots' eyes widened simultaneously. General Patterson? Captain Rodriguez asked. The Joint Chief's advisor? Ellen sighed. Robert Patterson was a major back then, commanding a security detail assigned to our medical unit. When the attack came, he caught shrapnel in his chest and neck. One of the pieces nicked his carotid artery. She paused. The memory suddenly vivid. The blood pulsing between her fingers, the sound of mortar fire in the distance. Patterson's eyes locked on hers as his life literally flowed out onto the desert sand. He would have bled out if you hadn't performed emergency surgery, Commander Howard finished for her, while coordinating the evacuation of 14 wounded personnel and calling in air support using a damaged radio. The female pilot, Chen, shook her head in amazement. And you did all this with no combat training? Just medical training? Ellen took another sip of her coffee before answering. Lieutenant, I grew up with 4 older brothers on a ranch in Montana. I learned early that when something needs doing, you just do it, whether you're trained for it or not. She smiled slightly. But yes, the combat first aid course I took during officer training did come in handy. Captain Rodriguez chuckled, then grew serious again. What about the part where you used a satellite phone to guide in the rescue helicopters through the dust storm? The report said you had to climb onto the roof of the damaged field hospital to get a signal. Ellen nodded. That part is true. The regular comms were down, and the dust storm was making visual navigation impossible for the rescue choppers. Someone had to get to higher ground with the backup satellite phone. While the area was still under sniper fire, Commander Howard added. Ellen shrugged. The snipers weren't particularly good shots. This earned a laugh from the pilots, breaking some of the reverence that had built up in the conversation. Ellen felt herself relaxing slightly. It had been years since she'd talked about Al-Qaisuma with anyone who understood what it had really been like. The most remarkable thing, Commander Howard said, is that every single person Colonel Thompson evacuated that day survived their injuries. 14 wounded personnel, some critically injured, all made it home. That's why they called her the Angel of Al-Qaisuma. Ellen shook her head. That name never made sense to me. Angels are supernatural beings. What happened that day wasn't supernatural. It was just people looking out for each other in the worst of circumstances. That's all military service really is when you strip away the uniforms and the rank and the protocol. A thoughtful silence fell over the table. After a moment, Lieutenant Wilson spoke up. Colonel, if you don't mind me asking, what are you doing on a commercial flight to D.C.? Are you attending the ceremony tomorrow? Ellen looked at him sharply. What ceremony? The Medal of Honor ceremony, Wilson replied. For Colonel James Hart. I assume that's why you were heading to Washington. Ellen's expression softened. Yes. Jimmy and I served together in 3 different theaters. He saved my life more than once. She paused, then added quietly, I wouldn't miss it for the world. Commander Howard checked his watch. Speaking of which, I should check on the status of your flight. The storm seems to be clearing, but there might be a backlog of departures now. He stood. I'll be back shortly. As he left, Captain Rodriguez looked at Ellen with renewed interest. You knew Colonel Hart personally? His actions in Kandahar are legendary. Jimmy never thought of himself as a legend, Ellen said. He was just a combat medic who couldn't stand the thought of leaving anyone behind, even if it meant going back into a burning building 3 times. The reports say he saved 17 lives that day, Lieutenant Chen said. 18, Ellen corrected softly. They never counted the local child he pulled out last. The official reports sometimes miss the details that matter most. Outside the windows of the officers' mess, the rain had stopped, and patches of blue sky were beginning to appear between the clouds. Ellen glanced at her watch, wondering how much longer their flight would be delayed. As if reading her thoughts, Captain Rodriguez spoke up. "Colonel, before you have to leave, would you consider addressing some of our junior officers? We have a training group that would benefit enormously from hearing your experiences firsthand." Ellen hesitated. "I'm not sure that's a good use of their time, Captain. The tactics we used at Al-Qaisuma are 30 years old now. Warfare has changed." "With respect, ma'am," Lieutenant Wilson said, "some things haven't changed. Leadership under pressure, making impossible decisions with limited information, putting the mission and your people above your own safety. Those things are timeless." Ellen looked at the earnest faces of the three pilots, the next generation of military leaders, carrying forward the lessons learned in blood by those who came before. Perhaps there was value in sharing those lessons, in making sure the knowledge wasn't lost. Before she could respond, Commander Howard returned, accompanied by a tall, distinguished-looking officer with Brigadier General stars on his shoulders. Ellen immediately began to rise, but the general waved her back to her seat. "Please, Colonel Thompson, remain seated," he said, his voice deep and commanding. "This isn't an official visit." Ellen settled back into her chair, studying the general's face.